What is the Talmud and how does it relate to Jesus and the New Testament? Well, in this episode, I'm joined by Dr. Isaac Oliver, an expert in early Judaism and Christianity. And Isaac is going to help us unpack what the Talmud actually is, how it developed, and why it's so often misunderstood. And just as importantly, we're going to challenge myths and stereotypes about the Talmud that continue to fuel confusion and even anti-Semitism today. Hey, Isaac, it's great to see you today, man. You and I have known each other for a while. We've hung out at SBL, had some good times together, and I know you've got a super busy summer here. But hey, just want to thank you for taking some time to be on the Bridge Builders Forum today. It's great to see you.
Likewise, I'm looking forward to this, and I hope it's going to be an enjoyable moment.
Yeah, I always enjoy talking to you, and so it's going to be fun. And of course, we're gonna dig into our conversation in just a minute about the Talmud and all things Talmud, which of course is an incredibly important topic. But I also want to just tell our audience a little bit about a little more broadly about Dr. Isaac Oliver. You, of course, we're going to talk about your program and organization and learning opportunity, Talmud for everyone. But of course, you do a lot more than Talmud. You are do extensive work in early Judaism and Christianity, and you've put out some great books. I'm actually an Isaac Oliver book collector here, so I thought you'd get a kick out of this. Remember that this is like an original Torah Praxis after 70.
Flashy gray cover from Morris Seebeck.
Look at that thing, man. Yeah, this is this. You had to take out a second mortgage to get a hold of this thing, or I did. But actually, you know what? I think you sent me this for free. So I
think I gave it to you for free. And for the record, 0 royalties on that book. That's what we do in academia. The sacrifices we make for the cause. But I'm flattered.
And it's sad. It's so sad because it really is a phenomenal book. Now, this is the more recent one. This is the same book, I guess, updated that you did with Whippenstock. And truly, of course, I'm joking around a little bit, but this is a fantastic book. This is, of course, your the book version, I think, of your PhD. Is that correct?
That's right. The gray cover one that you have is based on my dissertation that I did at University of Michigan. I rewrote it a bit, published it with the series called Wundt in German, Wissenschaftliche Untersuchungen zum Neutestamentlichen Wissenschaft. Studien or something like that. I forget the acronym, but it's basically a renowned, respected monograph series in New Testament studies published by Morris Seebeck, a German academic press. Very costly, but at least in academic circles respected. And then I had it recently reprint. The other version has a much nicer cover with
from Whippenstock.
Yeah, with Whippenstock, with a new preface. It's a 10-year anniversary version that was published exactly 10 years after the first one, where I kind of reminisce and offer some perspective reflections on the book. But otherwise, the content itself is the same as the first monograph. It's really the preface and the covers that are different. The price is unfortunately not very accessible. That's not of my doing either. That's more Seebeck again. You can see I have a love-hate relationship with the press. They still have the copyrights even for the reprint. And so, Whippenstock, they're known for producing books that are cheap, and that was my hope. But they couldn't because more Seebeck is still taking his share.
But I don't remember. Yeah, I don't remember what I paid for this, but it was worth it. I mean, this is a really excellent book, and it's referenced in a lot of other works. It challenges, as it says on the back, conventional views of the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, as well as Acts. And of course, you read these as very Jewish texts. And so, I know it's a really good book. And then I also pulled out your this book you did, Luke's Jewish Eschatology. So that was another one you did. And you've done a lot of Paul stuff. And so I just wanted people to know that we're going to be kind of digging into Talmud stuff today, because that's within the range, very much within the range of your, area of specialty and expertise. But you do a lot of stuff on Acts, Paul, Luke, and it's really, really great stuff. So, yeah, anything else you want to tell us about your work? And actually, maybe just tell us where you are and what you do as a professor at Bradley, and then we'll
Yep.
dig into the Talmud.
Yeah, I've been here at Bradley almost 13 years a servant. This is where
Wow.
I got my first job after doing a postdoc at the University of Michigan's Franco Center for Judaic Studies. I started as an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies here, and then became associate. This year, I was promoted to full professor. And it's not something I'm making public yet, but Bizrat Hashem,
Yeah.
I'll be going to another university soon. But until the final paperwork is done with the agencies that be, I'm not making that a public event yet.
Yeah.
Yeah, my specialty, is early Judaism and Christianity with what I would call a sidekick of early Islam. I really started doing Judaism and Christianity, the Greco-Roman world. There was a fantastic program at the University of Michigan, doctoral program, that studied those two traditions together. And I went into that doctoral program because I was convinced that one cannot understand Christianity apart from Judaism. And
Yeah.
to a certain extent, vice versa. If we're talking about the origins of both of these religions, it's important to study them together. And so I was looking for a doctoral program back then. This was 2006 when I started my doctoral studies that had a robust, curriculum program offerings in both religious traditions. Hence my enrollment at the University of Michigan, which I do not regret. Once I came to Bradley, they hired me as a biblical studies professor. So teaching, we only have undergraduates in the religious studies program. So I did the courses in Hebrew Bible, in New Testament, but immediately wanted to develop the Judaic studies curriculum. And so I created an intro to Rabbinic Judaism, which really focuses on the Talmud.
Yeah.
And I was also commissioned to teach the Intro to Western Religions, which is basically Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. There's where I started to develop my sidekick, as I put it, into Islam, where it's like, okay, I don't really know much about Islam compared to my expertise in early Christianity and Judaism. What's my gateway into Islam? And for me, naturally, it was the Quran, and when I started reading the Quran, for me, it's a treasure trove of not just biblical parallels, but parallels with extra biblical literature, including rabbinic literature. There are some fascinating parallels in the Quran with Talmudic text, for example, but also other
Yeah.
early Christian and Jewish texts. And so gradually through the Enoch Seminar, I'm one of the
Yeah.
vice directors. Enoch Seminar is a international organization dedicated to study of Second Temple Judaism and Christian origins, as well as rabbinic and Islamic origins. I started to collaborate with colleagues who are specialists in Quranic studies and edit a volume called The Study of Islamic Origins. So I've been working on that as well in parallel to what I do in Jewish and Christian studies.
Yeah, no, and I love your emphasis on how all of these developments, whether we talk about Judaism, Christianity, Islam, you can't really study how these things developed just by looking at one track. I mean, because there's a lot of interweaving and responding to the other and borrowing in some ways. And so I think that's an important thing that you just mentioned in passing that would be for another discussion. But there's a lot of weaving, I guess we would say.
A lot of zigzagging, partings, but also confluencing of the ways.
Yeah, gotcha. All right. So, of course, within the range of what we're talking about, of course, the Talmud is something that you are very interested in. So I want to kind of pivot into that. And I think a good place to begin our conversation about the Talmud is to highlight that you actually started an entity, an organization and called Talmud for Everyone, which I love the name of that. So this is an educational initiative. It's open to everyone. It's open to Jews. It's open to Christians. It's open to people who are just interested, maybe who don't have a religious affiliation, but want to learn more about this incredibly influential body of literature that we call the Talmud. And so we'll talk more about the organization, and I want folks to know how to get involved potentially and know what's going on and follow your YouTube channel. But I'm just curious, Isaac, what inspired you to want to help? And this is really set up for non-experts, non-expert regular folks. What inspired you to want to help people to learn and experience the Talmud? So what need did you see there?
It's a good question. As I said earlier, when I came here to Bradley, just because of my personal interests, not just professional, but personal interests, I wanted to develop a Judaic studies program here at
Mm-hmm.
Bradley, at least a concentration. And so I immediately created a course, Introduction to Rabbinic Judaism, first time in the history of Bradley.
That's
There
cool.
is a large Jewish student body here at Bradley. There's a Hillel Center, there's a Jewish fraternity, sorority, there's Chabad as usual everywhere, and other things. And so I wanted to develop the Judaic Studies program, first of all. The second thing is being involved with the local Jewish community. At that time, one of the local rabbis of the Reform Temple, was leading on Thursdays around noontime a course that was open it was designed more for the Jewish community, so Jewish
Mm-hmm.
students here at Bradley, but also Jewish folks from the Peoria community, which is where Bradley is located, to just come and learn about Judaism. It was called The Story of Us. They approached me, so the local Hillel organization approached me and asked if I would be willing to replace what the rabbi was doing as an educational component, being the only Jewish professor here specializing in early Jewish studies. And I said gladly, gladly so.
Yeah.
And I've always been, once I discovered the Talmud, or the Talmud in the Anglophonic pronunciation, I guess, I became a bit infatuated with it, I might say, or even in love with
Hmm.
how it approaches things, how it discusses matters, all kinds of matters, and so forth. And so I'm a real aficionado of the Talmud. And I said, well, as an educational service to the community, both to people here on campus, as well as to the wider city of Peoria, how about we do something on the Talmud? And I wanted it to be something that would be welcoming to people of any background, not just Jews. And in fact, if you go to the website talmudforeveryone.com, I believe you'll see the description there. Talmud for Everyone was designed as an endeavor that facilitates the study of the Talmud to people of all backgrounds. I like to joke,
Right. I love that.
even Jews can come. I like to just joke that way. It's just to make
That's
people
good.
feel
That's
comfortable
good.
about
Yeah. Yeah.
coming, not worried about, oh, can I come to this if I'm not Jewish? No, on the contrary, we want everybody to feel welcome. And many, if not the majority of the attendees are non-Jews who find the Talmud very interesting. So it started in 2016. And I'd say the rest is history. It's developed a lot more since then. We started really just meeting 2 Sundays a month during the academic year, which we continue to do. Then during COVID, we had to, of course, transition online. And so we had our live studies online. Once the pandemic was mostly behind us, we retained a bimodal format where we continue to meet on site live, but then we have a portal that's available for people who want to attend online. And from there, I started to develop a website, a
Right.
YouTube channel with some podcasts. We became officially a nonprofit organization like
Yeah.
yours in the state of Illinois.
Right.
And we have ambitions to continue growing.
Yeah, I love it, man. I think it's really good. And I think you made a really good point in that, I think there's a lot of Jewish people, like myself, like I grew up, I had a bar mitzvah, but I really still, the Talmud to me is like this deep ocean that I feel, I only feel very comfortable just kind of getting a few feet in because it's such a deep, and it can be a little bit intimidating. But again, the further I go in, the more I see just how, I would just say, magnificent it is as a and just so interesting and important. But we'll get into that. But I think it's also important I'm so glad that, you really emphasize and make this open to everybody, because there's just so many misconceptions about the Talmud. And we'll get into that a little bit. But
Absolutely. Yeah, the Talmud is foreign, I would say, in my experience, to most Jews. I
yeah,
mean, even to me, I didn't grow up as in a Haredi community
right.
studying in a yeshiva. Once I, had my bar mitzvah or something like that. My entry into the Talmud was late. It was primarily within the academic sphere.
Yeah,
And then later a bit in confessional Jewish circles. And my experience is actually most Jews, they're not familiar with the Talmud, and they
yeah,
find it to be a foreign, strange text, hard to relate. But, Talmud for Everyone was trying to do is, I guess, meet that challenge and demystify the Talmud for Jews and non-Jews alike.
yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I would say for most of the people who are watching and listening to our conversation here, I'm pretty confident that most people have heard of the Talmud, and if they haven't, if people listening, watching, if you haven't, that's great. That's even better that you're here today. But even for those who have heard of it and maybe even dabbled in it a little bit, I think there is a significant misunderstanding, even on a basic level, Isaac, about what the Talmud is, and its place within the broader scope of rabbinic sources and Judaism. So let's just start our conversation here. Use the word demystifying. That's a great word. Introduce us, Isaac, to the Talmud. What is it? And how and where did it originate? Just kind of help us understand that a little bit.
You're making me think of the story that's in the Talmud of a Gentile who wants to convert to, Judaism, and
Yeah.
tells there are two rabbis that are always disagreeing with each other, Shammai and Hillel. Teach me the Talmud, basically, while I'm standing on one foot. It's
Right.
just like
Right.
it's a huge.
It's an impossible task, right?
And one rabbi, of course, it's Shammai, who's more irritable and less patient. He's like, I don't have time for this. Rabbi Hillel, and hence the name, the Hillel centers that we have around the country in the United States, is the more patient, loving person. So in the spirit of Hillel, I'm going to try to answer that question while standing on one foot, as it were. I mean, the Talmud is the rabbinic text par excellence. There are many rabbinic texts, but this is the mother of all rabbinic texts. It's if we're talking about its volume, its sheer size, it's an encyclopedia. You can really think of it back there somewhere. If I'm pointing, it's hard to point with the camera in front of me. That the Talmud's over there. It's several volumes. We're talking with its base text, which is called the Mishnah.
And Isaac, I got one here. I mean, this is just one part of one section, and there's imagine this times what, 60 or 70 of these.
Right.
Well, actually more than that, because this isn't even one full tractate. So
because you have the one with the English translation, I imagine. So it doubles the size.
Yes, that's true.
That's the Schottenstein edition, which is very useful. Yeah. So we have 63 what are called tractates in what is called the Mishnah or the Mishnah. So what's the Mishnah? The Mishnah is, scholars debate about what its original function was, but let's just think of it as a collection of discussions by rabbinic sages, rabbis. Mm-hmm. They're called rabbis, but not in the sense that we think of rabbis today. If we're thinking of rabbis today, we might think, that's the spiritual head of a synagogue, a religious center. These rabbis were specialists in Jewish law, Jewish religion. They viewed themselves as hachamim in Hebrew, sages, wise guys, if we want to put it that way.
Wise guys, literally, yeah.
And so they're discussing about all matters that have to do with Torah, with the Torah. And so the Mishnah contains the discussions of these rabbis who lived roughly during the first 2 centuries of the Common Era. So from the 1st century all the way to the beginning of the 200s, give or take. That's the Mishnah, and it contains 63 tractates. So think of those as treatises, as different volumes, if you want, that deal
Yeah.
with a variety of topics, from agriculture to holy, the high
Festivals,
days, the
right? Yeah,
festivals,
like Shabbat, all those. Yeah.
Sabbath. There's a tractate called Shabbat, Passover, Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement. There are discussions about sacrificial law, about purity, but also about family laws. So marriage, divorce, you name it. It's comprehensive. It aims to really discuss Jewish life in all its aspects, not just what we tend to think maybe in a Western, modern, secular context of religion. Religion being this compartmentalized segment of our life that maybe some of us pay attention to, if at all, when we go to church or temple or whatever. This is like everything in your life is discussed by these rabbis who lived during the first 200 years of the Common Era. So that's the Mishnah.
Okay.
The Talmud, then, now we enter the Talmud. The Talmud is a commentary on the Mishnah.
Okay. Right.
It doesn't. There are in fact two Talmuds. There's a Talmud that's called the Talmud of the Land of Israel,
Yeah.
Talmud Eretz Israel, or the Yerushalmi, sometimes the Jerusalem Talmud.
Right.
Most people don't study that Talmud.
Right. And I got that one. I love how Art Scroll, they differentiate. This is a green and this is the Jerusalem or Talmud Yerushalmi version. So I got these out for some props here. Sorry for those who are just listening to the podcast for if you can't see what I'm referring to. But yeah, and then this is the Babylonian Talmud.
The Babylonian Talmud.
Yeah.
And so when we're talking Talmud, we're talking Babylonian Talmud. Now, why is that? Actually, I don't think we can really quite know. The Talmud of the Land of Israel, or the Jerusalem Talmud, sometimes called the Palestinian Talmud as well, it's not viewed as equal in its literary quality as the Babylonian Talmud. A lot of, for example, there are many repetitions, and we might say unnecessary repetitions in the Jerusalem Talmud. Whenever there's a thematic link, they say, oh, let's just copy and paste a whole block of material we already included in one tractate, for example.
Okay.
The Babylonian Talmud is viewed as a greater, more elaborate, sophisticated literary text. Also, the Jewish centers of religiosity started to shift towards Babylon. Particularly, we might say once what's called Palestine, what was renamed Palestine by Hadrian after the Bar Kokhba revolt, which was from 132 to 135 CE. Once that place was renamed as such, and then especially once the Roman Empire becomes the Christian Empire, with beginning with Constantine, with the Edict of Milan in 313 CE, things do deteriorate for Jews living under the Christian Empire. I'm not going to say it was horrible always everywhere. That would be an exaggeration and a simplification. But some people think those political factors, amongst others, contributed to this shift towards Babylon. There always was a Jewish community in Babylon ever since the exile by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BCE, so biblical times. And that community really became the rabbinic center after the Christianization of the Roman Empire. And then once Islam, the Arabic Empire, basically just takes over all of the most of the Byzantine Empire and the Persian Empire, Babylon becomes the main Jewish center for quite a while. And so the Babylonian Talmud just becomes the Talmud. It's called the Bavli, if you want, the Babylonian Talmud. But when people say the Talmud, they think the Babylonian Talmud. And after its consolidation, Jews in the yeshivas, when they study Talmud, they're studying mainly the Babylonian Talmud.
Got it. Yeah. And I think what you said, you used a word earlier that I think is a good point of emphasis. You said it's a conversation. There's a lot of going back and forth and expressing of opinions and, sometimes telling stories, but it's this wrestling. It's this dialogue of wrestling over all these different matters. Is that kind of what you were getting at? Is that a good way to think of the Talmud in a simplified way?
That, that's correct. As soon as you open already the Mishnah, because the Babylon
Yeah,
Talmud is commenting on the Mishnah. If you open the first tractate, which is called Brachot, blessings, it deals with prayers. It starts discussing the Shema. The Shema
mm,
being, let's say, the quintessential, foundational, biblical prayer that
sure.
one is supposed to recite as a Jew according to Rabbinic Judaism. They start discussing the evening Shema, like you're supposed to recite it evening and morning. Uh, if you just open the first page of the Talmud, you're going to see an excerpt from the Mishnah about the evening Shema, and then a discussion by rabbis in the Talmud. But the Mishnah itself is already starting this debate back and forth. The Mishnah
Yeah,
gives you three opinions when you're supposed to recite the evening Shema. And hence, people are not sure. I mean, from a scholarly point of view, the Mishnah itself, which is the foundational rabbinic text on which the Babylonian Talmud builds, they're not sure if the Mishnah was originally just a compilation of sources, different rabbinic sources, or was it a teacher's manual? A teacher was
yeah.
using this to teach rabbinic students, or three, whether it was a code of law, like, okay, what am I supposed to do as a Jew? What's the Jewish law? Was the Mishnah that? There's a debate
Mm,
about that, and maybe it's all three of the above. The Mishnah was all three of the above, because sometimes if you're just reading the Mishnah, and by extension the Talmud, which is a commentary on the Mishnah, you're not too sure okay, so what is the take? What's the
yeah,
takeaway? What am I supposed to do as a Jew? What is, in Hebrew, we say the halacha. And maybe I'll just throw that in there.
yeah.
The Talmud commentary on the Mishnah. The Mishnah is primarily just halacha, which is laws, legal stipulations, legal applications of the law. We're talking the law of Moses here,
Yeah.
the Pentateuch, the five books of the Torah. The Talmud then comes later on. These are rabbis who lived after the beginning of the 3rd century CE,
Yep.
and they're commenting now on the Mishnah, but
Yep.
they toss in a whole bunch of things as they're discussing the Mishnah, which is called Agadah or
Mm,
Haggadah. The Hebrew is Haggadah, the Aramaic is Agadah. Haggadah, I like the definition that one of my professors provided me when I was at the University of Michigan. Agadah is just everything that's not halacha. So it
okay.
can be stories,
Like stories, yeah.
stories.
Like the Passover Haggadah. The Passover Haggadah is like a story. That's the same word, right?
It's absolutely the same word. So the Haggadah for Passover is the telling of the story of Exodus, right? Leaving Egypt. So it can be anything: narrative, stories, poems, parables, anecdotes, proverbs. The Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, has a lot of that incorporated into its halachic discussions, which makes for an even more exciting text.
Yeah.
But it remains very argumentative. The Talmud itself, Rabbi so and so will say this, but then Rabbi so and so will say that, and then the Talmud will try to zoom in and say, okay, so what's going on here? Why does this rabbi think this way? Why does this rabbi think that way? Is there a way of bringing these two
Ah,
seemingly divergent opinions together? And then you might get a third opinion. I wonder if this is where we get that saying, 3 Jews, 4 opinions, or is
yeah.
it 2 Jews, 3 opinions? I don't know. There must be three
Yeah.
opinions about that saying right
It's all true. Yeah.
there.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh man. Okay. No, that's good. That gives us a really good overview of it. And of course that's a tall task to try to encapsulate what the Talmud is, but I think that's a good start. Hey, if you're enjoying this conversation, I want you to know that the Bridge Builders Forum is more than just a podcast. We're a nonprofit dedicated to helping Jews and Christians better understand their faith, the Bible, and each other. And your support helps us host these vital conversations and create educational resources and interactive learning experiences. And yes, all donations are tax deductible. So to give, just visit bridgebuildersforum.com, click donate. Every gift makes a difference. So I want to thank you for standing with us. And if we can serve you in any way, send us a message. I think most people, Isaac, understand that the Talmud plays a huge role in Judaism. But again, we've already alluded to the idea that there are plenty of misconceptions. Again, not just by Christians or non-Jew, whatever. But by even, I think there's a lot of misconceptions about the Talmud among Jewish people as well. So, but I would say a common misperception is that Judaism prioritizes the Talmud over the Bible. So let's just kind of discuss how this works in Jewish life. What is the significance of the Talmud for the Jewish people, historically speaking? And how does it relate to the Torah and the Jewish Bible?
That's a big question, because it depends which period of time we're looking at. It depends also which hat I'm wearing. If I'm wearing my historian's hat, my academic hat, the one trained as a professor in religious studies, which is supposed to be strictly, to the best that it's possible, to the extent that it is possible to be objective and not biased towards any text or against any text. Before the Common Era, let's say before the 1st century, there is no Talmud, there is no Mishnah. It's true that undoubtedly in biblical times, from the very beginning, there always were oral traditions. The written text, so I'm talking about the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, the first 5 books of Moses, for example. They're not exhaustive texts. They don't contain everything that there is about ancient Israelite religion, even how to run the temple. The priests, when there was the temple, the first temple, the second temple, surely they had other knowledge, information, just as old as the written text, that they would apply or use as a complement, naturally so, to run the temple, to administer it, so forth. So there always were oral traditions in the history of Judaism, no doubt. When we're talking Talmud, though, strictly speaking, now we're talking of the rabbis, these sages who emerged only starting in the 1st century, especially after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, when the Romans destroyed that temple as a punishment against the Jews who didn't want to live under Roman rule, and there was a war that led to that. The Talmud tells several different stories about the relationship of these rabbinic teachings to the Bible, how it sees it. Probably the most famous one is this story that is in a tractate in the Mishnah called Avot, Pirkei Avot, teachings of the fathers, teachings of the elders, something along those lines. Which is mainly just a tractate that contains ethical teachings, a bit like, if people are not familiar with the rabbinic literature at all, but if they know at least the Bible, think Book of Proverbs a bit, wisdom sayings.
Yeah, that's a good way. Yeah, it's one of the most, probably the most accessible tractate of the Talmud, arguably. But it's really a fun read.
Right. And in fact, this is a tractate that doesn't contain a commentary in the Talmud. The Talmud itself doesn't comment on every tractate in the Mishnah. And interestingly, it doesn't have a commentary on tractate Avot in the Talmud proper. But like you said, it's very accessible. And many Jews, maybe they're not studying full pericopes, full tractates of the Talmud, but they'll know some of these sayings from the Talmud because they're very well known. But that tractate opens with a saying, not a saying, like it has this grand opening. And it says, Moshe kibel Torah miSinai. Moses received the Torah from Sinai and then handed it to Joshua. And then Joshua handed it to the elders. And then the elders handed it to the prophets. And then the prophets handed it to the men of the great assembly. And then the men of the great assembly, now you start to get names of sages.
Right.
And so the idea is that when Moses received the revelation at Sinai, he didn't just receive a written text, but also some kind of oral tradition that was handed down from generation to generation until the 1st centuries of the Common Era. So the tradition goes. And then there was a need, the traditional story says there was a need to write this down because a concern emerged that it could be lost and forgotten. Hence the Mishnah. Mishnah was published in writing sometime in the 3rd century CE. But the Talmud is not a very, it's not like a, systematic theological treatise that systematizes or gives you just one view or perspective on this matter. It doesn't clarify exactly, okay, so are you telling me that all these teachings of these rabbis that are in these 63 tractates, word for word, they go all the way back to Moses? It's not quite clear about that. There are different versions about views about the relationship between this rabbinic Torah, let's call it rabbinic Torah, which is oral Torah, and then the written Torah, which is biblical Torah. One view is that, if Moses were alive today and you could come and see what we're discussing in the rabbinic Torah and the Talmud, he would agree and give us his approval that this is Torah as well, that this indeed at least agrees with the spirit of the Torah for new times. Because in some ways, what the oral Torah is, what the Talmud is an attempt to actualize the biblical law, to make Judaism a religion that lives on in the absence, for example, of the temple that is destroyed by the Romans in 70. And so, there isn't one view in the Talmud itself about the relationship between Bible and Talmud. Often you'll see, in fact, in rabbinic discussions in the Talmud, a distinction being made between a halacha, so a legal precept, that is deoraita, which in Aramaic means from the Torah, or a halacha that they say is de rabbanan, so of the rabbis. And they'll say, hey, this legal precept, we admit it's a rabbinic teaching, even a rabbinic creation, that it really doesn't have much of a connection with the Bible. And they'll treat that differently than a biblical precept. A biblical precept often is treated with greater severity. Like you have to be more careful not to break that than a rabbinic precept. But that's not always the case. It's often the case, but not always the case. Once the Babylonian Talmud becomes the Talmud, so around the 7th century CE, I think for many, if not most Jews, it's going to become almost just as, if not just as important as the Bible, until we reach the modern era. In the modern age, you have, of course, how could I put this, a fragmentation of Judaism in a certain way. And so Reform Judaism, which is the largest liberal Jewish movement in the United States, in its early days in particular, where it originated in Europe, it was very anti-rabbinic. It rejected the oral Torah, the rabbinic Torah. So that when we're talking about, what is the importance of the Talmud today, it's very significant, no doubt, but to various degrees, depending on the Jew and the Jewish movement we're talking about.
Yeah. No, I got that. That was good, man. That was a lot of good detail. I mean, I don't think we can overstate how important the Talmud has been for the Jewish people for a good portion of the last 2,000 years. But, my experience, Isaac, and you gave some nuance that I think at least supports this idea, is that overall, it's like, there's a certain way, like, for example, at my synagogue, the way we handle the Torah scroll, like the written word of God, it's not, it's a very special, like we have a Torah service. We handle the scroll in a very careful way. And it just sort of highlights that there's just, scripture and Torah is something a little bit different. I mean, it's not, even though, again, the priority and the role of the Talmud is massive. I feel like at the end of the day, there's nothing like the Torah, right?
I mean, I'd say that, but also I would point out that the very way that in most Jewish circles today, where the written Torah, you're alluding to the Torah scroll, is handled, is based on rabbinic halacha, or is based on rabbinic custom. I was just listening to a podcast yesterday in Spanish, a very good podcast on the book of Revelation. And the thinker in question was describing the tefillin, these, so-called phylacteries that Jews wear. If you're a righty, and most of us are righty, you wear it on the left arm, right? Near the heart, because it's near the heart. And then on the head. And the way this thinker was describing these tefillin, it was based on rabbinic texts.
Sure.
It's true that there are some tefillin that were discovered amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls, so really old, the oldest ones that we have, and those are pre-rabbinic tefillin because they're, strictly speaking, from a historical perspective, and I'm putting again my University of Michigan hat or my religious studies professor's hat. There was no rabbinic Judaism before the first century, and so these phylacteries, these tefillin, are not rabbinic. But the way this scholar on this podcast was describing the tefillin was based on rabbinic texts, rabbinic halakha, and so it's true. It's true. You handle the scroll in a very liturgical way, ritualized way. But those protocols are based on rabbinic tradition in most Jewish settings today. The Talmud, you're supposed to still treat it with respect, but not in this same way as the Bible. So there is a distinction.
Yeah.
I would still, caution against thinking of a rabbinic Jew as some kind in some kind of, and it's nothing against Protestants, but there's not such a hard, clear demarcation between scriptura and tradition. I'm thinking of Martin Luther, sola scriptura, and then you have everything else is just human tradition. This is not there's not this clear demarcation. It's a little messier, the lines between the two, but the demarcations are there as well. So it's a complex
because
story.
If you go to a yeshiva or into a traditional, even in my synagogue, I go to a Chabad, and it's when we say we're going, there's going to be a Torah study, that could be from the book of Exodus, or it could be something from the Talmud. And so I think what you just said is really important, is that line of demarcation is not always so clear, and that word studying Torah can refer to Talmud as well.
Yes, because from a rabbinic point of view, Torah, there are two Torahs. There's the Torah shebichtav, the written Torah, which is basically the biblical texts, the scriptures. And then Torah shebe'al peh, the oral Torah, which is basically the rabbinic text. Both are Torahs. Both in some way go back to Moses. Again, the rabbinic tradition has various ways of explaining this relationship.
Right.
I sometimes, just for purposes of simplification or as an entry point for Christians, for example, and it's not a great explanation. In fact, just as I'm thinking out loud here, I'm not hesitating to share it, but I will. And then we can talk about it. What the New Testament is for Christians, the Talmud is for Jews. So that's a big statement I've made there. I've just said that many Jews don't even read the Talmud or know what's in there, etc.
Sure.
Now we can complicate, right? I'm already complicating the generalization I just made. I mean, in some ways, the New Testament, a lot of it sees itself as containing things that are fulfillments of what was anticipated in the Hebrew Bible. The rabbinic Torah has a different function already, if we're just thinking of it in that way. But if again, it depends which Jews we're talking about. You mentioned Chabad. Chabad is the best known Haredi or ultra Orthodox movement because it's very present. It reaches out to people who aren't part of the Haredi movement. But in a Haredi yeshiva, what the men will be studying, because it is gender differentiated, it will be primarily the Talmud. You learn Tanakh, Bible, as a child, but then the meat, if you want to put it that way, once you're older, is Talmud, or that's the study, the main study for a Jewish male in an ultra-Orthodox or Orthodox setting. And maybe just one other thing. I know I'm going in all kinds of tangents, which must be driving you crazy here.
No. It's good. Yeah. No, I love it. Freestyle.
Another reason, I'm not trying to be virtuous here in any way whatsoever. I respect the different communities, the different viewpoints that are out there. But Talmud for everyone, it was created for people of all backgrounds and genders. What I mean is women too. are welcome to our space, because for a long time in traditional circles, women weren't allowed to study the Talmud. This was viewed as a male enterprise, if I may put it that way. Things are changing, even in Orthodox circles. But outside of Orthodoxy, we have more and more women, for example, who are engaging in the study of the Talmud.
It's such an interesting and I think important trend. But, Isaac, you were just talking about, this, if you went into a yeshiva and people are studying, actually, I want to talk a little bit about Talmud study. So even just as basic as, okay, you're sitting down even with your group or whatever it may be. And what's on when people are studying Talmud? What do they do? Like, what does that mean? What's on the page of a Talmud that people are actually engaging? I think that there's probably a lot of folks that don't know the answer to that.
Right. So, and you're pointing to your volume, which is a printed edition, right? So there's a different kind of layout once you have printed editions of the Talmud starting in the 1500s versus the, pre-print industry, where you had manuscripts and a lot of it was more oral based, where you might just have, in the Middle Ages, for example, a manuscript with a text of the Talmud and not much more. Once you have the printing industry and then volumes like the one you have at hand right there, the printers, those who printed these texts, they're like going to they take advantage, and they're like, oh, let's include, in addition to the Mishnah, a little verse from the Mishnah, and then the commentary on the Mishnah, which is the Talmud. Let's add like more commentaries on the commentary on the Mishnah. So commentaries on the Talmud on the margins.
Right.
So
it's everywhere. I mean, this page, it's like there's barely any white on this page.
Yeah.
Like it's just like absolute. I'm looking. I can imagine for somebody who's never cracked the Talmud before, it's like this. How does this make any sense? Yeah.
Yeah. So you have you could even maybe show it to the audience there. I could pull out mine right there, because it's like the middle column, which is the Talmud proper, and then people might see on the sides marginal commentary. I mean, comments on the margins is what I mean. One is by Rashi, and Rashi was a rabbi from France from the 11th century CE, and he wrote a commentary on most of the Babylonian Talmud. And then you have on the other side another margin with commentaries by the Tosafists. The Tosafists were students of Rashi from the Middle Ages, many from France as well, and they added commentary. And then you'll have even some other smaller notes.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's like verses. Okay, here's the biblical verse that they're alluding to, because the rabbis in the Talmud, what they'll very often do is be very terse. They'll just mention the first words of a verse, and not give you the complete citation, and like, okay, where does this come from? You'll have that as well. So basically kind of like a concordance is what we would call it, and so forth. So it's a lot. It really shows the textual aspect of Judaism. Judaism is, as Jacob Musner, one of the greatest modern scholars of Judaism from the second half of the 20th century, beginning of the third millennium. You said Judaism is the religion of many books, right? Because very often people talk about the Jews as the people of the book. Even the Quran refers to Jews as Ahl al-Kitabi, the people of the book. But we're the people of many books. Commentary upon commentary.
Right. But I think what you've, I want to kind of bring this back to center before we pivot a little bit, is that at the end of the day, like what all this, some people might look at this and be like, oh my gosh, that's exhausting. It seems like overkill. And maybe in some ways it is. But at the heart of it, at least my take, and I'd love to hear yours, of course, is it's a wrestling. It's a wrestling with, you used a really important word that I think is important for our audience to know, halakha. How do we, it like means to walk. How do we walk out the written Torah that, that God gave? How do we walk this out among changing circumstances and so forth? And so ultimately that's what this is. Would you say that that's what all of this is wrestling with?
Yeah, halacha literally means walking, as you said. So how do we walk according to the Torah, which is for the rabbis according to God's ways? And I like the imagery of wrestling. That takes me back to the image of Jacob
Yeah.
wrestling with God and then getting a new name, renamed Israel, which one etymological explanation for Israel is the person who wrestled with God, right? And
Yeah.
Jews are those who wrestle with God, wrestle with finding the meaning, and that meaning, only comes through dialogue,
Yeah.
discussion with the texts that precede us, but discussion with one another.
Yeah.
Truth is not reached in isolation, myself alone here in this office, however comfortable it may be, reading silently my book quietly at a Barnes and Noble, for example, with a cup of coffee, which is lovely. It's a
Yeah.
delightful
Yeah.
thing.
Sure.
I
Nothing
like my
wrong with that. Yeah.
I like my quiet time. I spend a lot of time studying by myself. And actually, one of the reasons why I created Talmud for Everyone was to get out of that loneliness and to
Ah.
study with other people. Because rabbinic study, it comes through what's called chavruta, a term that you know well, which we can translate it, if we want, as fellowship, as friendship. One saying in the Talmud that I like is "O havruta, o mituta," or "O mituta, o havruta." Give me fellowship, or give me, death. It's there's something about
Yeah.
studying with others, studying
Yes.
together, and so, without wanting to over idealize
Yeah.
Judaism or over idealize the Talmud itself, you study Talmud with other people. And so when you go into a yeshiva, you study with other people. It's a very loud place. People are talking back and forth, split
Right.
into pairs. You're reading with a chaver, which is a friend, a partner, a colleague. And that's something I try to reproduce in the manner that is possible in the context that I'm in with Talmud for Everyone. Is we just come together as a group, we're reading out loud the text together, and we're just trying to wrestle with each other.
Yeah.
Okay, what does this text mean? What is it saying?
Yeah, that's really cool. I'm so glad you brought that out because yeah, the idea of Talmud study in isolation, that's just like that's not really a category. It's something that's done in a group with partners and I think that's a beautiful thing because when we're wrestling with it together, we can challenge each other and think more deeply. So I think that's important. So, Isaac, I want to pivot slightly and we're going to move to the relationship between the Talmud and the New Testament, which is very interesting and I think significant. But before we do that, I want to ask for some of your thoughts about not so much what the Talmud is, because I think you've done a good job of giving an introduction to that. But I think we should discuss a little bit how the Talmud has been misused and even attacked. And I would say, to use a strong word, in some ways it's been demonized, especially by those who are anti-Semitic. And so these groups tend to quote objectionable excerpts from the Talmud that maybe have to do, there might be a passing comment about Jesus or Gentiles or something having to do with sexuality, as if these viewpoints are standard in Judaism. And I do want to read you a quote, a very recent quote. So some of these objectionable texts even led the very popular modern influencer Candace Owens to post a tweet not long ago where she said that she takes great issue with any person who purports to be a Christian defending the Talmud. Our Lord and Savior is not in hell boiling in excrement. So that was her tweet. So, okay, all that said, what are some of these objectionable ideas in the Talmud, and how should we understand them?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, these controversies are not new. I mean, once the Talmud becomes an authoritative text, so a text that has religious authority for Jews, it becomes a source of controversy. I see my role primarily as an educator, right? So I'm a scholar of religion, of
Sure.
religions. That's one thing I do. For example, I alluded to earlier as vice director of the Enoch Seminar. That's an academic organization. So it's really designed for scholars and scholars discussing amongst each other about scholarly things. Talmud for
Right.
everyone's not strictly speaking an academic endeavor. It's an educational endeavor. Now, it's
Yeah.
definitely informed by academic principles, by academic publications, and scholars participate in it as well.
Yeah.
Colleagues of mine give talks and so forth. But it's primarily an educational endeavor. So we're making it accessible to people. And so when it comes to these kinds of controversies, like the one you alluded to by Candace Owens, for me, the best remedy to fight these misconceptions is just to educate. It's like, come study the Talmud with us. There's nothing to hide. I have
Yeah.
nothing to hide. All people are welcome to come. And we don't just cherry pick. When we've been doing this since 2016.
Yeah. You're pushing 10 years. Yeah.
Pushing 10
Yeah.
years soon. We should have a celebration for a 10-year anniversary or something like that, come
Yeah.
to think. Every other Sunday, we have been reading line after line. We're still attracting brachot the first chapter.
Wow.
I mean, because we're, initiates. We're just,
Sure.
but we don't skip any part. So if there's something that's nice, great. This is a beautiful text. So look how beautiful this text is. It's saying, for example, in the Talmud, say, love your neighbor, draw all people to the Torah. So there's some lovely sayings. But then we might come across a text and we're not, it's not such a pleasant text. How can I put that?
Yeah.
But then again, I could say that there are some texts that are not pleasant or delightful, at least for an outsider, in the New Testament or
Sure.
in the Quran. And the best thing to do is to contextualize everything, is to meet the text. So let's take this text in the Talmud. Yes, there is a problematic text. I wish it wasn't there, but it's there, so I can't deny it, about
Yeah.
Jesus being judged and condemned and lying in excrement. But guess what? Paul in Philippians says the Torah is excrement as well.
Yeah.
Go back to Philippians there. I mean, I recently we had a Paul Within Judaism panel, which maybe you attended, organized by
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
Enoch
Sure.
Seminar. And one of my colleagues translated the Greek term there is crap. I was just like, whoa, okay, that's a...
Yeah. Was
that
it scubalon? The Greek word's like scubalon or
Yes.
something like that? Yeah.
But when we look more
Yeah.
carefully at the text, we might be comparing here apples with oranges, as they say in English, because at the end of the day, I don't think that Paul was intended to devalue the Torah. He's
Sure.
saying, next to this new revelation and experience that I have had now in Jesus and my conviction that he rose from the dead and we're entering into this new reality where there will no longer be sin and death, everything else is like garbage.
Yeah.
But at the same time, he'll say the Talmud, the Torah is holy, righteous, and good, right? In Romans and
Yeah.
so forth. The rabbis of the Talmud, I think, had little to no knowledge of the New Testament. They didn't read the New Testament. They didn't read the Gospels. I'm not convinced by that. They rarely speak about Jesus. In this sea of the Talmud, we're talking 63 tractates. Jesus is rarely mentioned.
Yeah.
And we're only talking about the Talmud here, the Babylonian Talmud. There's also the Talmud of the land of Israel. I haven't mentioned a whole bunch of other rabbinic texts that are also from the same time as the Talmud. Midrash, which are these commentaries on the Bible.
Sure.
They're mostly silent about Christianity. At least they don't speak explicitly about Christianity. When they speak about Christianity, they're speaking about the Christianity that they know. The indirect or sometimes direct encounters that they have with Christians, which weren't always the best encounters, to say the very least. I think to really make a fair judgment of the passages that are in the Talmud, the few passages that are there about Jesus in the Talmud, you would have to compare what the patristic literature, so the church fathers, who are the contemporaries of the rabbis, Saint Augustine, Saint Jerome, Chrysostom, Justin Martyr, the list can go on. But basically, the Talmud stretches from the 1st to the 6th century CE. If we're including the Mishnah and then the commentary on the Mishnah, the Talmud contains teachings of rabbis from the first 600 years. It's a huge corpus of traditions and texts. Let's compare that now with what the church fathers are saying about Judaism and Jews at the same time.
Sure.
And you're well versed about this topic. A lot of it is not good stuff,
Right.
Jews are being persecuted. Their rights are being limited. People are even being forbidden from converting to Judaism. Jews are being, exiled, etc. I don't want to paint like everything is horrible and lachrymose.
Yeah.
But if you were to really make a fair comparison, I would say these few texts, without trying to justify or defend their content, in some ways pale in comparison to what Christians are saying. And so what we have here is sadly a record of a time when Jewish-Christian relations weren't so good, weren't always so good, where they were marked by polemics. Polemics, I tell students, is basically you're attacking the other person. You're attacking the other person's views, often in an unfair way. I tell people, well, think social media. That's where a lot of polemics is going on. People are just attacking you, taking things out of context. Unfortunately, that's how Jewish-Christian relations were. Thankfully, we're no longer there. Jewish-Christian relations are much better today.
Sure.
But back then, in what's called late antiquity, these first, let's say, 600 years or so, the relations are not so good, and Christians have the upper hand. And that upper hand is often, unfortunately, an abusive hand because they have power. They have political power. So then, in that context, you have these rabbis who are responding to polemic in kind. Okay, this is what you say about us Jews. Well, we're going to say this about your religion, and this is what we're going to say about Jesus. I wish that text, in particular that one text, wasn't in the Talmud, but it's there.
It's
I can't take it out of it.
You can't sanitize it. You can't sanitize it.
I can't rewrite it. I can't rewrite history. I can't deny either, for example, and this is just my opinion, that the Talmud's a very patriarchal text. Only men are rabbis. Only men speak amongst men, and even make rulings about women and about their bodies, etc. But to a large extent, that's true about the Bible. That's true about the Quran. That's true about patristic literature as well. And it's not my, role, at least in my capacity as an educator, to make judgments, moral judgments about these people who lived, if I may put it this way, a long, long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Now, what we do with these texts today is a different question. And I'll just add one more thing and shut up for the time being. This passage about Jesus being judged and lying in excrement, which is a deplorable text. I'm sad it's there. I think most Jews don't even know it's there because, like I told you, most Jews don't read the Talmud. But even those Jews who do read the Talmud, this is one passage they read.
It's one thing. They're not worried. It's not
a halachic text. This is, I think, very important because I return to what the Talmud is. It's mainly a commentary on the Mishnah. The Mishnah is primarily about halacha. So what do I do on the Sabbath? What do I not do on the Sabbath? Okay, how do I keep kosher, etc., etc. That's halacha. Halacha is more authoritative for the rabbis. It has greater weight than Agadah. When it comes to Agadah or Midrash, so, this is my commentary on the story of Abel and Cain. Like, I think that Abel had a twin sister because otherwise, how did they have children, right? It was just Cain and Abel.
Yeah.
This is what we call Midrash or Agadah. It doesn't have the same kind of weight. It's more storytelling. So we Jews today, and I have little authority as an individual Jew. I'm just a scholar of religion. But I think we Jews today, we have no reason whatsoever to hold on to this story and just see it as a story that reflects an unfortunate chapter in Jewish-Christian relations, and let's move on.
Sure. And as you said, things are so much better today. Thank God, then they're improving, and I hope that continues. But no, you did a good job there, Isaac, of just saying, hey, look, the context and the situation in which those statements were made are very, very important. And it brings my mind back to something that Krister Stendahl said about, not being careful not to compare, the worst from somebody else's religion with the best from yours. And so to me, I think what I would say passionate about is just say, okay, these few passages and texts in the Talmud that we're not going to sanitize. You're saying we need to be honest. They're there. We wish we weren't, but they are. They don't define the Talmud. They don't define Judaism. And thank God things are in a much better place today. So,
And I'll add just one more thing to that, if I can. There's so much more we could say about this topic. There's a colleague of mine, Daniel Weiss, at Cambridge University. I'm really excited about his book that he's working on. Hopefully, it's coming out soon, about Jesus in what's called Tanaitic literature. So the Tanaim, I didn't mention who the Tanaim are, but the Tanaim are the rabbis or the rabbinic sages of the Mishnah. Basically,
the Mishnah.
The rabbis who lived during the first 2 centuries of the Common Era. Basically, those rabbis. He's working on a book dealing with their views on Jesus. And he's got some thought-provoking ideas. I don't want to do too much like spoiler alert, but he's actually showing there aren't just negative views. There are some positive views and encounters between these rabbinic sages and followers of Jesus of that time in their milieu, in their settings. So that's something to just keep
that's
your
very interesting.
Alert to. Hopefully,
okay, I'm on alert. I want to hear more, but
I've interviewed him already once for my Talmud for Everyone channel on a different topic. But definitely when that book comes out, we'll have another podcast, or you can have him too.
Yeah. Well, that actually is a good segue into kind of the final kind of big topic that I want to talk about here before we wrap this up, and that is the relationship between the Talmud and the New Testament. Boy, I read, Isaac, as I'm sure you do, I see all kinds of things about, in whether it's scholarly books, popular books, and, everything in between about what is this relationship between the Talmud and the New Testament? Is there a direct line? Is the Talmud the key to understanding the New Testament, vice versa, whatever? Now, you've already mentioned that the Talmud began to be written down shortly after, the time of Jesus, Paul, and the New Testament. But I guess my question is that I'd love to hear your thoughts on, are there Talmudic elements maybe in the New Testament? Do we see Talmudic maybe previews, if you will? In other words, like when we see references in the Gospels to the tradition of the elders, like in Matthew and Mark, or the seat of Moses. These are just some phrases, that sort of stick out. Are these preludes or soundings of what would later be collected in the Talmud? What are your thoughts on that link?
This is a huge topic and continues to be debated in scholarly circles. I happen to be, as you know, you've looked through Torah Praxis, my first book, one of those scholars who does use early rabbinic literature or classical rabbinic literature to study the New Testament. So, classical rabbinic literature is basically all of these rabbinic traditions from the first 6 centuries of the Common Era. That's when the Talmud is growing and being produced. But we have to be very careful. There used to be a time when people thought, oh yeah, everything that's in the Talmud and the other rabbinic literature from this period goes back to the 1st century and even earlier. And so we can use this as a source without any critical scrutiny, judgment about the layers that are in this text. That's Strack and Billerbeck, which originally was written in German, being translated into English. I think 1 or 2 volumes are already out in English translation, if I'm not mistaken. And these were German scholars who just, it's a useful text, but at the same time, it can be, I don't know what, maybe even dangerous. I don't know if I'm exaggerating by using the word dangerous, but
Okay.
to say the very least, misleading text, because they can take. Well, first of all, it's a sort of like cherry picking, to use that imagery again. Let's take a text here. Let's take a text there. It's a mishmash of a whole bunch of snippets of rabbinic texts taking out of their contexts, right?
Yeah.
A lot of these rabbinic snippets that appear in Strzok and Billerbeck, they appear in much larger discourses within the rabbinic literature that are important. Context matters. So they're taken out of context, and they create these misconceptions about rabbinic Judaism, almost as if, okay, these were central matters. Some topics were really central because you're able to just amass a whole bunch of passages from a whole bunch of various rabbinic texts and create
systematizing
it based on, I'm not trying to be polemical here, I'm being critical, but based on a certain kind of Christian perspective and prioritization of like what's important for me as a Christian, what's central or of interest for me as a Christian. Well, it's things like Christology, soteriology, eschatology, etc., ecclesiology. When the rabbis, they might have other priorities or discussions. So there is that distortion that is created in Strzok and Billerbeck. There is also the issue that some rabbinic texts, many rabbinic texts, they're much later than the New Testament, right? They can be very late, centuries after the Common Era. So I would say two things. First, I don't think just because the rabbinic literature is posterior to the New Testament, so later to the writings that are now in the New Testament, that it should be therefore entirely discarded and ignored. I'm not of that school of thought, because there are scholars of the New Testament, maybe most scholars of the New Testament. I think I can say that. At least based on my personal observation, most New Testament scholars are not conversant with rabbinic literature. Maybe because it's a very daunting task.
Sure.
Yeah. Maybe because they've been warned, hey, these rabbinic texts are later. And so they're like, oh, great. I don't have to study them then. And I'm dispensed from this very tedious task of having to engage with this very wide corpus of literature. So I'm not of that school of thought, like, oh, we just ignore it entirely now since it was written after the time of Jesus. Because there are layers. There are multiple layers. This is a multi-layered cake. And some of these layers are early and they go back to Jesus, but we have to look at it on a case-by-case basis. So that's one thing. The other thing that I think is...
before you move on to the next thing, so what I hear you saying with that first point, because I think it's really important, is that you're saying is that we have to be very careful to not think that, okay, the writers of the New Testament, whether that's Paul, whoever, as this is coming together, it's not like they were well versed in all of it's misleading to think that they were well versed and that they understood all of these later discussions and concepts that were developed later. But what I hear you saying is that we need to hold that, but also there are layers within the Talmud, and some of the ideas and concepts and reflexes of the Talmud do likely go back to the era of the New Testament writers. Did I get that?
Yes.
Right? Am I getting that balance?
You did. And I could say two things in response to that and then go back to my original second point. Is that one, let me just be blunt with you. There's no rabbinic Judaism at the time of Jesus.
Yeah.
If I'm speaking strictly as a historian of religion, of course, amongst Jews or, traditional, in traditional terms, we say Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses our rabbi. Even Moses was a rabbi. But that is what we call it, as a historian, we call that an anachronism, something that doesn't technically speaking correspond to the time of Moses. Yes. At the time of Moses, strictly speaking, there weren't rabbis. There were priests. And Moses was from the tribe of Levi and Aaron was the priest, right?
Yeah.
So in the time of Jesus and even Paul, strictly speaking, there's no rabbinic Judaism. Rabbinic Judaism is only going to emerge after 70, and it's not going to emerge overnight.
Yeah,
it's a process in making. Jacob Neusner, again, to invoke the late Jacob Neusner, he speaks of formative versus normative Judaism.
Yes.
So the rabbis are rising, but most Jews are still not following rabbinic halacha. We're gonna have to wait until really the consolidation of the Babylonian Talmud, really the rise of Islam, 7th century, so much later, right? So that's a first point, which leads to the second point in response to what you brought up. Therefore, I don't think it's helpful to think of the Pharisees as proto-rabbis.
Okay.
That's a view that a lot of people throw out there. I don't think it's helpful because very often when I'm looking at what the writings in the New Testament are saying about the Pharisees or how the Pharisees are responding as they're portrayed in the Gospels, for example, it doesn't correspond to how the rabbis view themselves or even describe Judaism. So, for example, one passage very often is like the Pharisees or other Jews that are represented in similar ways as the Pharisees are like, well, show us a sign, give us a sign so that we can know you're the Messiah. Well, in the Talmud, you're not supposed to ask for a sign. I mean, there's that famous story about the oven of Achnai, which is probably the most famous story in the Talmud about two rabbis, Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus and Rabbi Joshua, arguing over this oven, whether it's a kosher oven or not. And Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus is making these miracles. It's like, well, if I'm right, then let this carob tree move, and it moves, like several hundred feet apart, according to the story. And Rabbi Joshua is like, what does a tree have to do with our discussion? And Rabbi Eliezer then makes the river flow in its opposite direction, still unimpressed, until even he says, well, if I'm right, let the Holy One, blessed be he, another way of saying God, say that I'm right. And suddenly a heavenly voice speaks out. And even that doesn't impress Rabbi Yehoshua. This portrayal of Pharisees or other Jews who are skeptical about Jesus' Messiahship as needing miracles or signs to believe doesn't correspond with the rabbinic mindset. And I could offer other examples.
So in other words, you don't see a thick path between wide path between the rabbis and between the Pharisees and the rabbis of the Mishnah.
Right.
Now, I'm sure you see, well, maybe you don't, but like there's some kind of genealogical connection, but you're not seeing a thick path at all.
Yeah. And there's, I think the rabbinic movement, which emerged after 70, it was like this composite movement. So there were people of different backgrounds. I mean, you have rabbis who were Kohanim, the descendants of priests, and identified with the priests, and the Tanaim, they rarely, if ever, identify themselves as Pharisees or identify with the movement of the Pharisees. There are traditions in the rabbinic text that are earlier and go back to time of Jesus, but we have to be very careful. Which actually takes me to the original second point I wanted to talk about, which is that sometimes it's better to really think about it the other way around.
How so?
Meaning that if we see something in the New Testament, because I see, as you know well, I think basically all of the writings that are in the New Testament, they're Jewish text. In their original context, they were written.
And you also, and I want to make sure people know, you make a very strong case that Luke is a Jewish text by a Jewish author. You got to get Isaac's work if you want to hear his full argument for that. But I did want to make sure that's a strong feature of your work, which I appreciate. But anyway, please continue.
Yeah. So for example, thanks for bringing up Luke, because I can now use Luke as an example, which I wasn't intending to do originally. Okay. Luke is the first, if I see Luke as a Jewish text, then Luke is the first text that we have that refers to the custom, which is still done today, of naming a newborn child on the 8th day.
Yeah.
Because in between Luke, which was written, first century, somewhere thereabouts, there's a debate about that, but we don't have to get, sidetracked. Between Luke we have to wait until this rabbinic text called Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, which is even posterior to the Talmud.
Wow.
It's posterior to the Talmud because it refers to Aisha and Fatima, right, who are related to Muhammad. It makes references to Islam. So it's written sometime after the 7th century CE. That's the first time we have in a Jewish text the reference to naming the child on the 8th day. And for boys, that's the day also when they're circumcised.
Right.
So what's interesting to me is like, well, why do we always have to go backwards? So we take the rabbinic text and then we work our way back to the 1st century. Why don't we sometimes think about it the other way? Let's look at the earlier texts, like the New Testament. And if we then encounter materials that are in the rabbinic texts that are preceded by the New Testament text or other earlier texts, then we know the rabbis, they inherited materials that preceded them. I think Jonathan Adler, who's written a book, The Origins of Judaism, with the Yale Reference Library, does a fantastic job with this, where he's showing like, here's the archaeology. We have abundant evidence that in the 1st century in Judea, so in the land of Israel, Jews were washing their hands before they eat because we have all these vessels made out of stones. We have all these ritual basins like pools, the mikvaot. And now we can see that the rabbis, they inherited something and they preserved something, but then they were, of course, reapplying this to their time. So, to come back to Struck and Billerbeck, they had their intentions and many of them were good. Some of it was problematic, but they were operating under an assumption that I think is still widespread, and that one of my mentors, Gabriele Boccaccini, who was my doctoral advisor at University of Michigan, criticizes that Judaism, and when we're thinking rabbinic Judaism, it's this static religion. It never changed. So I can take a medieval commentary by the rabbis on the Book of Psalms, and that reflects exactly how Jews thought and behaved in the 1st century and even before, because Judaism is this monolith that doesn't change. It's just this relic, really, at the end of the day, which was waiting for Christianity to show up and be replaced by Christianity. Gabriele Boccaccini says, no, Judaism, like any religion, is a dynamic, organic religion which develops over time, adapts to new circumstances. And that's what we see in the rabbinic literature, which is, some of that as well.
Yeah. No, that's excellent. Because real life, things evolve, things change, over time. And we even see in Judaism today, Judaism today is not monolithic. It's so incredibly diverse. And that was true. I appreciate the emphasis on, when we talk about ancient Judaism, it's Judaisms, just like there's Judaisms today.
There's one more thing to that. Now because maybe I've overemphasized the differences between, classical rabbinic literature and Judaism, 1st century Judaism. And I just want to, emphasize that, as you know, I dig into the rabbinic sources a lot to study earlier Christian texts, but I try to do that with care. And one reason why I do engage with the rabbinic literature to study the New Testament is because in some cases the gap is really not so big as we imagine. In particular, if we're thinking of the Tannaitic tradition, so the Tannaim, right, the sages from the first 2 centuries, if the Mishnah, which is the prime Tannaitic text, was published sometime in the early 200s, if some of the New Testament texts were written at the end of the 1st century, even traditional Christian positions maintain that. In the Christian tradition, for example, Revelation of John was written at the end of the 1st century by John on the island of Patmos. But many modern scholars date a number of New Testament texts, not all of them, but a number of them, to the end of the 1st, maybe even the beginning of the 2nd century. Suddenly, the chronological gap between some of these written texts and the written Tannaitic texts is not that huge. And so I think the exaggeration sometimes. I'm now maybe talking too much as a scholar, I fear.
No,
In scholarly fields, sometimes I think the chronological gap is exaggerated between the world of the rabbis and the world of the writings that became part of the New Testament. But all of this work it's tedious. It has to be done on a case by case basis, and we have to avoid, these wide sweeping claims and approaches.
Sure. No, and I gotcha. Isaac, let's I want to, first of all, you're helping to educate us, and I appreciate that a lot. So let's just kind of wrap up the conversation by discussing just some of the practical implications here for modern times, and the benefits of a more widespread understanding. I mean, of course, we've already covered that. There are a lot of misconceptions about the Talmud and misunderstandings, but I think we've made it pretty clear, why, especially for Orthodox Jews, why they have the relationship to the Talmud that exists in modern times. But what about, to use the phrase you have for your entity, what about everyone else? What do you see? I would say maybe for Christians in particular, but not just Christians. What is the value for everyone in the way you use it, learning the Talmud?
Well, I think, there's this other phrase. For those who are well versed, it sounds cliche, but for a general audience, I think it will be novel. Torah lishma, which literally means Torah for its own sake. Studying any text, I think, has an intrinsic value. I'm a scholar, so I love to study, or I hope scholars love to study the matter that they study. And this may be one of the reasons why I am attracted to the Talmud, because it is very much in a certain way, a scholarly text. These are sages. These are people who love to learn. It's very textual, and I enjoy that. And there's a certain value, a certain beauty in just learning for the sake of learning without any kind of predetermined outcome. Just like, hey, let's just study for its own sake with other people together, So there's an inherent value in that. That's not particular just to the Talmud. You could do it with the Bible. You could do it with classical texts. You could do it with other texts. If we're talking the Talmud, of course, you get to know about what has become next to the Bible, if not in some ways more so, the definitive text for understanding Judaism. You can't understand Judaism. In particular for Christians, this is what I say in my courses, my intro to Judaism courses, which have people of all backgrounds, because where I teach is not just, it's a private non-confessional university. So many people, different backgrounds, even if most are of Christian backgrounds. So I tell them, if you only read the Old Testament, as it's called in Christianity, you're not going to understand Judaism, because Judaism is not just this religion that's frozen back in biblical times. It continued to grow and morph. And you have to really understand the rabbinic literature. Even those movements within Judaism that reacted against the rabbinic tradition. So I mentioned earlier Reform Judaism in its classical days, very reactive against the rabbinic tradition. You have to understand where their reaction is coming from. And to understand that, you got to engage with the rabbinic literature. And then today, Reform Judaism has been gravitating towards rabbinic tradition, or finding, generally so, a more positive appreciation of the rabbinic tradition, even if it doesn't engage with it in the same way that Orthodox Judaism does. So basically, if you want to understand the sources, the traditions of virtually all forms of Judaism today, the Talmud is essential. I put it that way. As somebody now, I speak maybe from my own Jewish affiliation, coming back to Pirkei Avot, that tractate of ethical sayings, wisdom sayings of the rabbinic sages. Heve mitalmidim shel Aharon. This is a saying of Hillel. Be disciples of Aaron. Ohev shalom ve'rodef shalom.
Peace.
Who love and pursue peace. And draw all creatures, this is what I find interesting. All creatures, kol briot la Torah. Bring them all to the Torah. Draw them all to the Torah. What I see there is like, I'm not trying to convert anybody.
Sure.
Judaism, in fact, is not a proselytizing religion. It doesn't seek converts, even if people can convert to Judaism if they wish. But I see there a certain kind of mandate or something I identify with, which is sharing Torah in the largest sense of the term. Torah means learning, instruction, knowledge with all people. And that's what the model is of Talmud for everyone.
Yeah, no, I think it's beautiful. I think it's so important. I think you hit on something really important, and that is if you want to understand Judaism, and thank God, there's a lot of Christians, and there's just a lot of people that want to understand the Jewish people, Jewish tradition, Jewish history. You need to understand, or the Talmud, because it's of course been such a defining aspect of it. So Isaac, I just want to thank you for your time. This has been an incredibly helpful conversation. I really just want to express how appreciative I am. I'm thankful for you as a friend, but also just as a scholar, as a historian, all that you've done. And again, I think we mentioned Paul a couple times, but you've done some incredible things, really good work on Paul as well, which I appreciate. And I just think what you're doing goes a long way in helping people better understand both Judaism and Christianity. And of course, that's something we're very passionate about here at Bridge Builders Forum. So, Isaac, if folks want to get involved with Talmud for anyone, or just learn more about what you're doing, your YouTube channel, give us the info and the details on that.
Yes. So, we have a website, talmudforeveryone.com. Where you can learn more about our endeavors. There you'll have soon, later this summer, the schedule for the sessions when we'll meet, these study sessions.
Online, right?
Yeah, online. Or if you're in the central Illinois area, you're welcome to join us in person. We would, of course, appreciate if you contact us beforehand so we can know who you are. So there's an email address. It's talmudforeveryone@gmail.com. talmudforeveryone@gmail.com.
Yep.
And then there's a Talmud channel as well. It's on YouTube /@TalmudForEveryone.
Yeah.
And so those would be some ways to follow us. There are some plans for the near future. Many things have been going on, with my life, as you know. And so right now it's the summer. Talmud for Everyone's a bit dormant, but this discussion we've had has animated me and makes me eager to resume and begin other endeavors. We have hopes to spread Talmud to other parts of this world now that I might be going somewhere else. Talmud for Everyone will continue to have a presence here, a local presence in the state of Illinois, because it's really important for us to have this havruta in person. Sure. But we also intend to build some centers elsewhere. My colleague, who is co-leads the studies, Vlad Niculescu, is now at the University of Bucharest, so we're hoping to start something there. Cool. But those are ways to be in touch with us. You can write to talmudforeveryone@gmail.com. That's the email address. You can go to the website, talmudforeveryone.com, and you can subscribe there as well, and check out our YouTube channel. Those are ways.
Yeah, and I'll include links to the website and the YouTube channel in the show notes. But hey, Isaac, thanks for being with us today. Keep up the great work. I appreciate you, and hope I'll get to see you in Boston.
Yes, I'm looking forward to that. Thank you.
All the best, my friend.
All right, be well.
Hey, I would love to connect with you further, so feel free to leave a comment or send me a private message. And the best way for us to stay in touch is to sign up for the Bridge Builders Forum email at bridgebuildersforum.com. This will keep you informed of cutting-edge resources and opportunities for us to connect and learn together. Additionally, the Bridge Builders Forum is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and your support helps us create content that overcomes misunderstandings and advances ideas that build bridges between Jews and Christians. So we'll be back soon to discuss more ideas that help Jews and Christians better understand their faith, the Bible, and each other.